the Future of Infrastructure group. And this group is an industry-based organization that is based here in Canada, made up of leading companies across the infrastructure sector, so cross-section of the infrastructure sector, who come together to work with our public sector partners and take on some of the challenges of delivering infrastructure projects in this country from a policy perspective and also a practical delivery perspective. I think if there's been one benefit of the pandemic, it's definitely been the use of Zoom and other tools to bring us closer together and make the world smaller. And we're definitely lucky to be able to have panelists from across the world join us here today. We're very grateful for such an excellent group joining us. And to benefit from the learning that has taken place in Australia around this very topic. So in March, many of you will have seen that Canada launched its engagement around its first national infrastructure assessment. So this is a big step for Canada. We know that not very long ago, it was fairly new to even have infrastructure asset management in most jurisdictions in Canada. And so we've come a fair way in the last 5 years with that. And so we're very happy to see the federal government launching this initiative to help inform a sustainable long-term approach to infrastructure planning, funding, and delivery. Some of you will know that Australia undertook its first infrastructure audit in 2015 and did a second in 2019. So actually, quite a bit of a head start on our experience here in Canada. We're looking to learn from the experiences that happened there, help draw on those as Canadian jurisdictions across the country who join us here today are undertaking some of this very thinking and feeding into the federal government's process. We're looking forward to a great conversation. And we encourage people to share their insights in the chat, to ask questions as we go along. We're going to try and make it as interactive as possible. The session is being recorded, so just so that everybody is aware of that. We've had requests from a number of people from governments across Canada who wanted to hear from our panel, and we hope to be able to share some of the information that's gathered here today with others who weren't able to make it. So just on that note, before handing over to our chairs for today, I guess, wherever you are, it's a day, Rowan Mills from Arup and Catherine Jones from Plenary Group. I wanted to first introduce Robert Judge and Gerard Peets from Infrastructure Canada, who are going to provide an overview to us on the Canadian process that they have launched, just so that we kind of can use that as a frame of reference for the conversation. So thank you again for joining us, everybody, and I'm going to hand it over to you, Robert and Gerard.
Thanks, Olivia. Robert Judge is the Director General who's responsible for standing up our national infrastructure assessment. So I'll turn it over to him quickly. But just to introduce myself, my name is Gerard Peets, and I'm the ADM, Assistant Deputy Minister at Infrastructure Canada for Policy and Results. And we've been kind of working on this idea for some time. And so it's really exciting to kind of get it to this point and to be able to engage in these kinds of conversations. I just wanted to say thank you to the folks at the Future of Infrastructure for organizing this, and to everyone joining, whether it's a good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I think as federations, we certainly do have a lot to learn from Australia. You've made some inroads that we're very interested in, and I think we're set up for a great conversation today. So I'll just hand it over to my colleague, Robert Judge.
Thanks very much, Gerard. I'm going to see if I can share my screen here. And hopefully this will be coming up shortly. But as Olivia mentioned, the Minister of Infrastructure Communities launched in March public engagement on how to undertake Canada's first national infrastructure assessment. I don't have to convince the folks on this call of the importance of infrastructure across a broad array of public policy objectives. And so as we look out toward 2050 and think about how we're going to achieve economic growth, job creation, competitiveness, as we think about climate change, as we think about improving the quality of life for all Canadians, infrastructure will play a key role in what we achieve. Where will Canada be in 2050? We know we'll be in a different position than we are today. Our climate will be hotter, subject to more extremes of flooding and droughts and the like. We know that even in a relatively modest forecast scenario, we're likely to see a significant population increase. Our economy is forecast to be twice as large, but how that will look, where that growth in particular will be concentrated, we'll see. Demographically, we'll be an older population with a smaller share of the population in the active workforce potentially, and a more diverse country. And of course, this is just a flavor of some of the changes that Canada will be going through. Technology as well. We know we'll have very different vehicles on our roads in 2050. So again, thinking through the role of infrastructure in supporting the country through this changing period and maximizing public policy outcomes is really at the heart of what we're hoping this assessment exercise will get to. Whether it's within Canada or internationally, again, the value of undertaking more strategic national approaches to thinking about infrastructure is increasingly recognized. And fortunately, in the rationale for the call today, we have great international examples for drawing on in terms of thinking about where we want to go. And so super excited to hear about the Australian experience today. In terms of the engagement paper that was released on how we want to achieve an infrastructure assessment that is seen as independent and evidence-based and credible. 3 priority areas were in the paper looking for folks' input. First, in terms of the sectors that we want to cover in the assessment, what should we be thinking about? We know the UK has focused primarily on economic infrastructure. What about the systems and what we have built up around the infrastructure for managing it? What should we thinking? What should we be thinking there in terms of opportunities to improve collaboration, whether that's building standards or codes or skills training or thinking about new digital tools in our infrastructure space? And then finally, funding and financing. What are our options? Are there innovative approaches? Can we do a better job of leveraging private sector investment? In terms of our timelines, we're looking to get submissions in by the end of June, and later this summer publishing a What We Heard report. This will set the stage for developing the scope and mandate for the assessment and getting the independent advisory body stood up around the end of the year. And we contemplate that the final assessment should be produced by 2024. Immediate next steps, as I say, end of June, we're looking for written input on how we should design this assessment. And so I would in particular encourage Canadian partners and stakeholders on this call to consider providing a written submission. We'd very much appreciate it. Up to 10 pages. You don't have to have 10 pages, but we would really appreciate thoughtful comments. And of course, our engagement papers on the Infrastructure Canada website, along with the link for submitting. So I'll stop there, but thank you very much for the invitation to join this call, and very much looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you, Gerard and Robert. That was really helpful in setting the stage in terms of what Canada is looking to accomplish through the infrastructure assessment. So next on the agenda, we have Peter Colocino, Chief of Policy and Research for Infrastructure Australia with us. Thanks for joining, Peter. I know you've got a brief presentation for us, so I'll hand it over to you for your remarks, and then we can follow up with some questions after.
Thanks so much, Catherine. And just while I'm sharing my screen, can I take the opportunity to, again, thank the Future of Infrastructure for having me on the line. And also, I'm just delighted to be joined by so many of Australia's infrastructure leaders on this call. So I'm just going to look for a quick nod to make sure you're seeing a full display of my presentation rather than another mode, which is great. And I especially just want to take the opportunity to call out Adrian Dwyer, who's on the line, who is my predecessor in my current role at Infrastructure Australia, and has absolutely had a key hand in this journey that we've been on in Australia of evolving from audits and Australian infrastructure plans and through to a sort of a continuous cycle, I would say, across our policy and investment work. And it's really outlined by this slide here. And I use this just to contextualize what we do at IA. So we're an independent advisor to the federal government. We have similar organisations in each of our states or our province equivalents. And we really move on this journey from identifying problems, challenges and opportunities, which is the role of our audit, through localising those challenges in regions, the role of a current project we have underway called Regional Strengths and Infrastructure Gaps. And then we diverge into two streams of work. Firstly, our investment assessments through development of business cases and listing in our infrastructure priority list. And secondly, our reform pathway, which my team is focused on through our Australian Infrastructure Plan, which is currently underway. And your assessment really is a parallel to both our audit and plan. And in totality, our work fits in this 5-yearly policy cycle. So across 5 years, we conduct an audit, a book of problems and opportunities, then our plan, a book of non-build solutions. So it's only a book of reform. We follow up with investment through our infrastructure priority list, and then monitor and undertake performance benchmarking through our market capacity work, which we've commenced and are due to produce our inaugural report in August, as well as a report on progress for implementing the recommendations from the last plan. And Adrian, as I mentioned, led our last plan at Infrastructure Australia. And I'm pleased to say that while it's a 15-year plan, more than half of the recommendations that we put forward have been adopted in the first 5 years of our 15-year plan. So this 5-year cycle, we are in our third cycle around. While we've done 2 audits, we've in fact released 3 plans, and this is really embedded in infrastructure planning in Australia. And one document there I didn't mention is our report on the impacts of COVID, which obviously wasn't expected, but has become part of our policy cycle. And I'll touch on some of the findings in a moment. So I've mentioned a couple of times that we've undertaken 2 audits. I'm fortunate enough to have worked on both, and I can tell you that they are fundamentally different documents in methodology and process. And so to our Northern Australia audit, a document focused on just our remote communities and indeed harsher climates of Northern Australia, which was undertaken alongside the original national audit. And the evolution, the journey over time is to move from a focus on our state and territory jurisdictions or provinces to comparative analysis of places or settlements of similar sizes, to expand from economic infrastructure to also consider social infrastructure, to move from a really direct consideration of assets, concrete and steel, to think much more about services, people and places, and to take a forward-looking lens in our most recent audit, rather than looking at assets that are in situ and a retrospective reflection on how the assets might have attained their current conditions or quality. So we've tried to shift our document to be much more forward-looking, which we think is really critical in this period of high uncertainty and record investment in the sector, as we look to position for future growth in the economy rather than, as I've mentioned, looking back. So Australia is in a period of record infrastructure investment, both growing complexity, size and number of projects. We see around 400 billion of investment in our forward infrastructure pipeline, but in fact, we have a bow wave of investment that's growing and pushing out years as our sector struggles to deliver the record levels of investment that are required. That record investment is overlaid by a period of uncertainty. And I mean, we're seeing that uncertainty now in the pandemic. I believe you might be familiar with the record bushfire season we had over 12 months ago now. Equally, impacts of flood and drought are impacting much of the continent, laid on top of a period of rapid technological change, shifting geopolitical tensions, a range of factors that really mean the infrastructure that we have in place today will not be appropriate to counter for to provide for the needs of the future. So a shifting expectation of the sector alongside record investment. We also have in Australia, which in some ways I believe is a parallel to Canada, quite different levels of infrastructure provision in our largest cities as opposed to our small towns, rural communities and remote areas. So our four largest cities, our fast growing cities as we term them, of Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth, generally have high quality infrastructure, rich operating markets for infrastructure services, as distinct to our remote areas where, for instance, 1 in 20 Australians living in remote areas don't have access to clean drinking water for hygiene or water for hygiene. So we have quite a disparate level of infrastructure provision between our fastest growing cities and our small towns. We also have less growth in a middle band of settlements than perhaps they can accommodate. So we've made a particular focus on our smaller cities and regional centres and the role that they could play in supporting population growth. The audit also found or took a lens of analysing access, quality and cost of services in order to draw those conclusions around geography. And our findings were fundamentally infrastructure is relatively affordable in Australia. The pressure on household incomes is not high, except for the lowest quintile of income earners. Quality of services, as I've mentioned, varies between settlements, and access to infrastructure is challenged by our remote population and large size. So again, conclusions or parallels that are very similar to Canada. And I've mentioned this period of change. So we layered a series of issues that fell out of the audit around new technology, inappropriate subsidies and community service obligations that are poorly targeted and opaque, investment that doesn't have appropriate focus on growing national productivity and global competitiveness, our ports and airports, for instance, as well as the supply chains associated with them, continue to be areas of need. And in fact, there's a very large investment going into a new airport in Western Sydney currently. We acknowledge inadequate progress on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and a need for continued focus, as well as policy certainty and data challenges. So as we move into the plan, much like the audit, we've taken a fundamentally different approach to the way we've put this document together. And rather than one document, and the audit sits at 642 pages with 4,500 pages of analysis behind it, we have committed to develop a network of publications that provide both interrogation of need on the right through our needs assessment, including the audit, as well as strategic planning through our Australian infrastructure plan itself and detailed plans for each of our 6 infrastructure sectors, as well as 3 focus areas of industry, place, and sustainability and resilience. Each of our recommendations we're prioritising through a reform priority list, and then we're moving to supporting reform both through, or the implementation of reform, both through an implementation pathway, attributing timing and ownership for each of our recommendations, and 462 supporting actions, as well as detailed plans across our 3 cross-sectoral focus areas of regions or place, resilience and deliverability. Now, I just want to touch on a couple of the conclusions we drew from the COVID report, and I won't labour these, and I do encourage you to flick through this report, which is available on our website. But against the backdrop of the audit, the impacts of COVID have seen a much more rapid, this says rate of digitization, but in fact, digitalization of services and infrastructure, a decentralization of both population and infrastructure services with, for instance, an uptake of, or the uptake of solar PV growing during COVID, much greater engagement with local infrastructure, parks, roads, etc., and a fairly significant push in service innovation with a major change in the way, for instance, health services are delivered, relying on telehealth and digital consultations, as well as adaptability of services, for instance, using some of our social infrastructure like exhibition centres as potential overflow sites for health infrastructure. So these 5 trends of digitalisation, centralisation, localism, service innovation and adaptability are our takeaways from COVID. And through that, we identified 6 opportunities and 6 challenges that complement the analysis in the audit and really show this idea that every 5 years undertaking an assessment of infrastructure is far too static for the uncertain, rapidly changing environment in which we exist. And there really is a need for an always-on form of engagement, which will be the mode that IA is shifting to in the years ahead. So then shifting to the plan and the key messages that are likely to be the focus of our forthcoming document that we're releasing in August. Again, this notion of change and uncertainty is paramount. This period around, just to reiterate, digitalization rather than digitization and shift to a much greater form of engagement with digital service delivery, service adaptability, and of course, expectations from consumers of the options they'll receive. This continuing notion that Australia's infrastructure is very closely tied, or our services are very closely tied to our geography and density of population. We can't divorce ourselves in our planning and investment from the unique challenges associated with remoteness. A changing focus on investment from lowest cost to greatest public value and a more balanced outcome considering a quadruple bottom line. And you'll see some of those similar trends from the UK Green Book and the TAG, which has been released in the UK recently. Minimum service levels, particularly in those remote communities, and bridging a regional divide around service quality. And then finally, customer empowerment through data. I won't go into the specific conclusions we've drawn across each of the individual sectors, but I'll leave this presentation with Future of Infrastructure in case others would like to review this at a later stage. But what I would say is across the plan, our focus on both sectoral analysis and then cross-sectoral interaction is really quite critical. And I would encourage you to take a similar approach. And what I've seen of the initial thinking around the focus of the national assessment is very closely tied to the analysis in the plan. Just finally, I'll touch on our methodology, and very quickly, I just want to mention our use of the theory of change as an underlying logic framework through which we've been able to undertake our analysis, both issues identification and evidence building in the audit. A very significant process of engagement where we've seen now close to 6,000 organisations through the preparation of the plan, and then through activity identification tied into long-term outcomes and vision through the plan. We've also used multi-criteria analysis in order to allow comparison of reform recommendations from disparate sectors, comparing reform, for instance, in waste to energy, telco, or even industry productivity enhancements. So again, we've brought in our quadruple bottom line to represent community impacts, as well as user service impacts across access, quality, and cost of services, balanced against ease of implementation and risks in the implementation of reform. You won't be able to read the table on the left, but it's the 33 criteria that we use to analyse the impacts of each reform. And on the right, you can see the 1 pages we're producing around reform recommendations with the trade-offs across each of those areas in the bar charts on the right. So the way we'll be presenting Our analysis is in that one pager on the right, in a new product for us called the Reform Priority List. And we'll also be testing each of our reforms against overall greatest benefit, as well as ease of implementation through low-hanging fruit, some no regrets reforms holding up against different future developments or scenarios, as you can see on the bottom left of this slide, and our government's policy priorities for infrastructure on the bottom right. Just one final comment to say the timing for release of our plan is early August, where we have an eye on a window in the 2nd or 3rd week of August. So please keep an eye out. And again, thank you for the invitation. And I'm so pleased to see so many leaders from Australia's infrastructure sector on the line.
Thanks a lot, Peter. That was incredibly valuable information, and it certainly will be helpful to have a copy of that presentation to go back and review. We've got a couple minutes left, and I see we've got a question in the chat, so I want to hit that first. And if anybody else has questions, please use the Q&A function. So the question is infrastructure owned by the federal government, example, national defense, border protection, included in the infrastructure plan and audit?
Great question. So infrastructure owned by the federal government is included, and our federal government is principally responsible across airports. They have a shared responsibility and a shared responsibility around land transport. They have principal responsibility around telecommunications and shared responsibility around energy. One area that isn't included, however, is defence. We do have a mind for assets that have shared use, for instance, shared airports or shared port facilities. But because of the nature of the analysis in the plan, looking across settlements rather than specific assets, we're really able to look, if you like, beyond some of those finer details around ownership.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Just one other question. What would you, I mean, we know that there's been 17 post-completion reviews that have been completed in the last 4 years, and there's a tendency to finish work and move on. There seems to be some legal considerations holding this kind of work back. How can we make these a default and ensure that lessons learned are taken into account for future projects?
That's a great question. So we have as an obligation in our assessment framework that projects undertake post-completion reviews. And I think the number is 52 projects that we've assessed over the last 5 years or so. And as far as we're aware, only one project has released a redacted post-completion review. None have fully completed and released the post-completion review. So our run rate is atrocious. Post-completion reviews are both the requirement of our process, and they're tied to funding from the federal government through our national partnership agreements. So look, it's a really difficult area. I think politically, should the federal government withhold funding for a project because a review is not completed, it would be politically diabolical for them. So it's a really challenging area. We would say that better looking at conditions in funding arrangements, particularly where there's an equity investment from the federal government, is really a key lever. And once we start to develop if you like, a community of practice, perhaps, in sharing knowledge, we might start to see a greater inclination to undertake that sort of work. We are undertaking light touch post-completion reviews through our market capacity project, looking at risks cascading off projects. So that is if you like, a mezzanine to eventually arriving at a more complete view of project performance.
Great, thanks, Peter, and thanks for joining. I see a couple more questions, but I'm going to have to move on. But I'll ask John to keep those in the back of his head and maybe reach out to Peter separately to coordinate a response for those. But I'll send it over to Rowan for the next set of panelists.
Thanks, Catherine, and it's my honor to sort of introduce Adrian Dwyer, who's the CEO of Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, and Priscilla Radice, who's the CEO of Infrastructure Association Queensland. So thanks for taking the time to join us this morning. Adrian and Priscilla. We've got some questions, I think, that we just sort of wanted to run through. So we'll leave it to you who you think's best to answer. You know, I think one of the questions that was top of my list was, you know, what have been the biggest improvements since that you've seen since the first audit in 2015, and where needs the most focus?
I'm happy to take that. And I'll start by saying that you can all be assured that Pete's doing a far better job in that role than I did. And it's very comprehensive what Pete's gone through. And there's a big evolution of what Infrastructure Australia has started out at and what it's become. And it's now doing, I guess, that second or third iteration and building on what's happened in the past. I actually might just, rather than directly answering your question, Rowan, I think there are a couple of things that sit outside of what Infrastructure Australia does that it would benefit from. And the first and most important one is that the audit and plan process that Peter and his team are undertaking and the investment process that the other half of the IA business are undertaking, they're not a substitute for a government vision on infrastructure. And in fact, Peter's role would be helped by the federal government, the central government in Australia, having a view on what its vision of infrastructure is, what its objectives from federal dollars are, and that would be both constraining and constructive influence on the work that Peter does. So there's one key missing piece there for me, and a potential improvement is to give that those guide rails to Peter and his team. And then the second one is some sense of fiscal constraint. One of the biggest issues with the production of lists of projects, in particular, less so reforms, but particularly projects, is that we can all produce a great big long list of things that are good ideas. We can produce an even longer list of things that are questionable ideas. But without some sense of how much money is available to invest in those things, it can become a list that is too long and therefore unachievable. And I'm particularly attracted to the original UK National Infrastructure Commission model, where the government sets an envelope of investment and says to the National Infrastructure Commission, produce us a list of things to do in a prioritised order that meet that envelope of investment. Go over the envelope so that if we have more to spend, you can tell us where we should do it, and we will agree or disagree with those, but transparently tell you where we think the priority should be different, or a project not done, or one moved forward. I think that would also help Pete's work as well. So not a direct answer to your question, but some things I think around the edges would help IA and would help with your national infrastructure assessment and process as well.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. I mean, it raises a good topic around the idea of needs and vision, right? And I think the NIA, draft that we've seen from Robert lays out some key points that sort of crystallize that vision. I'd be curious as to your thoughts about how and Peter, I'd be interested in your thoughts as well about how you then go sort through what are the appropriate needs to meet that vision, and do the changing needs change the vision?
Yeah, I guess to some extent it's iterative. I think that the hardest of the two jobs that Peter has to do is the audit. The plan is markedly easier in the sense that you can start solving problems, you start having a view and applying how that view should be implemented. The needs assessment is much harder. I personally think the audit is misnamed. We're required to call it an audit. Peter is required to call it an audit because that's what it says in the legislation. But an audit implies you go out and count bridges and what condition they're in. I think a needs assessment is a much better phrasing for that. I know, Pete, if you had a differing or similar view.
Yeah, I mean, I'd add to what you've just said, Adrian, by saying we've done the audit a few different ways. So we've been out and counted bridges in the Northern Australia audit. We went and had a look at depth of channels and size of ships and whether they were going to be adequate. And you know what, as the central government, we don't have as good a view as the asset owner, or for that matter, the government that's closer to that asset. Similarly, we looked at the economic impact of assets historically and how it might change in the future. And I can tell you that was not the right approach. So I would just flag a bit of caution about using the approach that we used in the 2015 audit. And the approach we've taken in 2019 is to look ahead and try to understand where we need to go. And there's no doubt that we need to be forward-looking, particularly in this period of uncertainty, just to put a line under that. And that's not pandemic, that's climate change, that's changing geopolitical relationships, that's changing consumer expectations. And I think just adding to Adrian's reflections about the difficulty, we have really focused as IA on two things in concurrence with developing the plan. The first is building a capability in data and techniques around data analysis, and our work through our market capacity project, which we'd love to partner with Canada on, I have to say, is a real arrow in our quiver for future analysis. And the second piece is building genuine policy analysis skills. There is a big difference between understanding assets and understanding policy. And we've built a policy analysis set of skills and tools, which we can now re-employ and deploy repeatedly to allow comparison between reforms in disparate sectors. And that is highly valuable, we think, for having a rich and nuanced conversation. To Adrian's point, though, there is no substitute for clarity of vision. It is critical, and it helps us now that we have government priorities outlined in our statement of expectations to know which target to shoot for, because there are one set of reforms and projects we might pursue for decarbonisation, for instance, which would sit against a different set of priorities for improving services for remote Australians.
I think the coordination piece here is really key. It is vision, and I think that is lacking quite broadly in a lot of different countries. It's hard when there's so much change, it's really difficult to actually articulate where you're going. So there tends to be a lot of flux. But one of the key things that I really see missing, so in the Queensland context, we're in the middle of developing the state infrastructure strategy, and they produced a state infrastructure plan quite a few years ago now, and it's updated every couple of years. And I know that it talks to the IA plan, so this coordination role. But I don't think you can de-link what is the economic development outcome that you're trying to achieve from this infrastructure, and then also how do you actually engage with citizens, because you can have a really good policy, you can talk about density along transport corridors and how we reduce congestion in cities, but you will still have people lining up overnight to get a suburban block in the Sunshine Coast over an apartment in the city. So you have to be able to actually look at what are the aspirational things that people want. So I'm imagining Canada, and I've been there in Toronto a few times in my old life at Arup. The disparate nature and the diverse nature of a really big state, and how you manage those services and the equity of access is really important to this vision. And you can have a great policy, and I really love IA's approach towards policy in future. I think it's a really important shift, and industry is very much behind it. But if we can't engage with citizens around what the infrastructure needs are and what the ultimate policy and vision is, then there'll always be a mismatch between what you're trying to achieve and citizens buying into it.
Thanks, Priscilla. I mean, that's a really good point, and not dissimilar to what's happening in Canada, right? With the federal government that's responsible for, you know, in certainly very large projects, a good portion of funding, and you know, policy direction that's actually being delivered at the provincial and in some cases municipal levels.
Yeah.
So
I think this links back to funding as well. You know, fundamentally, especially post-COVID, governments are doing a lot of the heavy lifting while there is huge amounts of liquidity in the marketplace. And so how do we come up with, especially in the Queensland context where there isn't a lot of community support for government assets being privatised, asset recycling is not on the agenda here. And so how do you create PPP models that are actually supported by the community and get a lot of that innovation into digital and asset management and long-term kind of future thinking? And as Peter said, linking the infrastructure to the industries of the future, I think is where we'll get citizens to really buy into a much more private take-up of some of this infrastructure need.
Okay, so maybe just to all three, if you wanted to take a to sort of build on that. So we are at the point where all parties seem to recognise the investment in infrastructure is a good thing, but we sometimes see communities blocking projects in their local communities, as you're sort of talking about there, Priscilla, because they don't feel it will benefit them, or they don't quite grasp or understand what those industries of the future are or how they relate. So what do you think the solution is to sort of overcome some of that pushback that you're getting from the communities?
I might kick off first. So we're in a similar space here at the moment, in the sense that at the political level, there's not that much debate about this project or that project. It's typically who's going to do the project quicker. Whereas 10 years ago, there was real debate between political parties at elections about people cancelling a project in preference for another one, or one party platform being this suite of projects and another. And I think that evolution has been a direct product of Infrastructure Australia and then the state bodies that have sat underneath that and the degree of analysis that supports it. However, the original framing of Infrastructure Australia was that it would take the politics out of infrastructure. And I would venture that that is both impossible and undesirable, even if you could achieve it. And the reason it's undesirable is because of those local issues, where you need a politician who wants to build a legacy, because infrastructure is hard to do. It often involves taking people's houses. The impacts are very narrow. The benefits are typically diffuse. So you're gonna annoy people on the way. And if you've not got a politician with some backbone and a desire to deliver a legacy, those things will become too hard and they won't get done. So in your process, I would strongly encourage you never to say you're trying to take the politics out of infrastructure, because you don't want to do that. It's not a good outcome. You want to give politicians a menu of good options so that they're picking from good, well-considered things, and then you want them running full bore to get stuff delivered. You're not going to take away that local community angst about projects, because frankly the impacts are fairly concentrated on a small number of people.
Yeah, I just add to what Adrian said around that issue around politics, to say we live in democracies. Politics is democracy, and we should be proud of it rather than critical of it. And what we want is, just as we want in markets, well-informed decision making. And our role is to better inform decision making. And we do that through making more data available and offering a view based on that data. But without data, another opinion, even if it's from an independent infrastructure body, is just another opinion. So I really would emphasize strong evidence base, clear and consistent methodologies as the basis for comparison, as being the role for these sort of exercises. And to this particular issue, there is a theme in the forthcoming plan around trust and building trust in infrastructure sector decision making. We talk about better data, as I've just touched on, and we talk about forms and timing of community engagement, how to excite people around strategic engagement rather than NIMBYism, the not in my backyard style project to project conversation. So as I say, we've got more to say in the plan, but I'm sure Priscilla will have a view as well.
No, I agree. I think this links back to that original piece around vision. I think we've been trying to really, as an industry, what is our role? Because politics is important. It's a democracy. You would never want to take that out. But fundamentally, industry doesn't always help politicians and government to have a good conversation with the community. So how does the industry take responsibility for really talking about infrastructure as a service and what we're delivering, rather than taking a back-end project delivery? Well, we'll just deliver whatever project it is that you put out to market. As Adrian said, we've we have delivered projects that aren't the best project, either economically or for communities. So I think how we make the decisions around which projects are prioritised, both big and small across the country, where you've got such diversity and disparate needs, is actually quite tricky. Here in Queensland, we've got 1 in 6 Australians live in Southeast Queensland, but we've got a huge state with really growing other towns, but regional and rural areas with a declining population. And 70% of our local councils are not financially sustainable. So how do you manage across a really, really big state? And then you think about Australia more broadly, infrastructure as a service and delivering within a kind of safety net of what the environmental and community impacts are and what the economic output is. There always has to be a balance in that conversation. And I'm still not sure that we have the right shared transparency of how those decisions are made. And data is incredibly important, both to help make good behavioural decisions around how we get more capacity, but it's also about that lessons learned. So, Peter shared before how difficult it is to learn lessons across projects. We tend to restart again. The digitisation of data and the transparency and the open data push, where we, as many of you might know, we've just been preferred by the IOC for the bid. They met yesterday. It's been announced that the IOC would like Brisbane to be the next 2032 Olympics host, and that goes to the vote in July. So we've been pushing to talk about that as a pilot opportunity for us to actually bring all of our data in together across the agencies, and how do we then use that as a platform to pilot getting that overview of data across the state and across different asset classes. Hopefully that's the type of platform that can trigger some big reform, and then that can be rolled out more broadly.
Yeah, thanks, Priscilla. I think there's an old saying that you build infrastructure for people, not for outcome.
Yeah,
right?
correct.
So I think I'll turn it back over to my colleague Catherine, who'll sort of take us through the next section. But thank you very much for those responses, and please feel free to continue to join the conversation as we move forward.
Yes, thank you. So next on the agenda, we have the Australia-Canada Roundtable, where we've assembled some of our Australian colleagues to share their thoughts and experiences. Thank you all for being here. We've got Paul Crow, who's the Chief Investment Officer at Plenary Group, Richard Sharp, who's Principal at Arup, and Tim Gospel, Regional Director, Victoria for WSP. So I'm going to lead by just following up on that last question that Rowan asked regarding community objection and politics, and spin it a bit. In Canada, we're likely heading into a federal election this fall, so this next question is quite timely. As you know, promises made around election time can drive the agenda, especially for major projects, and rush procurements add costs. So curious to know from each of you if there is a way that we can set requirements for exactly what is needed before projects can proceed, and how much does politics shape these decisions? Paul, why don't I start with you?
Yeah, it's as the previous speakers said, you can't separate politics and infrastructure. And I think the role that the IA do is sort of providing that basis of information which can counter, and it's freely available to the public, and it gets reported on in the press, but that provides a balance to politics running away with too short-term a focus, and can call out the politicians a little bit on that, and helps the media provide a balance in that debate leading into elections. But it's we talked about a 5-year cycle of infrastructure plans, but we have generally here a 4-year cycle of elections, and the year before every election we get into the same sort of focus on announcements rather than a focus on real sort of policy or actually doing things. So it's a cycle that's hard to avoid. But you're right, if we have better selection and better evidence in the market, then hopefully there's a better lens for the community to analyse those election promises with. Yeah.
Perhaps I'd probably just add to that and say it's also really important for our opposition ministers. So whilst the government of the day has got access to bureaucracy and good advice, opposition parties don't. And I do think the sort of independent infrastructure, the I-body work, provides a really, really good source of rich information for opposition parties to make more informed decisions because they simply lack access to that good advice. So I think it's a really, really useful piece of work to inform both the government of the day, but also the opposition too.
So I'd agree with that as a basis for discussion. I think there's a role too for local government. We haven't talked about that so far, but if local government bodies are doing their job, they do have a more detailed understanding of local nuances and expectations. And certainly, I think there are some good examples, perhaps in our larger city governance of community-based conversation that is more meaningful about outcomes for individuals. So I think that's an important complement to the evidence base, if you like, that we've been talking about for the last 30 minutes or so.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, the silos between federal government and provincial government in Canada, you want to make sure that you know, those lines are not drawn, and so that's a helpful piece of advice there. I'm going to bring Olivia and Jody into the conversation as well, and if you have anything to add, otherwise I'll move on to the next question.
Not on that one. I mean, I think, you know, one of the key things as we think about sort of the broader infrastructure agenda is, you know, how do we foresee what's coming down the pipe? I mean, we've got a pretty good idea of what is needed today, but a lot has changed in 30 years. I think we have to not forget that. So as we do long-term planning, I think one of the critical pieces is how do we maintain some flexibility? And you know, I think one of the things that we do benefit from the political sort of involvement in the decision-making process around infrastructure is that it is kind of a bellwether on, you know, how citizens are viewing their needs and the infrastructure that's being delivered, and you know, where there is value in making those investments. So we shouldn't set that aside, I think, as we start to think about, you know, how are we going to grow? Those are good sounding boards for getting some of that information in.
Yeah, I would just add really quickly, I think the comment that was made around the focus around announcements in the political cycle being a very important driver of infrastructure. I think we will see a lot more of that over the next little bit as some of our politicians look to infrastructure as a road to recovery from the pandemic, which is a good answer, so long as that goes with all of the long-term planning that we've been talking about over the last half hour or two, and not just as a method to get you know, more work out into the marketplace quickly.
That was actually going to be my next question. So, you know, it's around procurement models, which seems to be shifting and evolving in Canada, particularly in response to COVID and getting projects out quicker. So my question is, how well are different procurement models and financing options incorporated into decision making?
Happy to lead off. I think pre-COVID, we'd probably say that most governments here did a very good job of making procurement decisions through their business case approval process as they were getting funding approved for projects. Obviously now with post-COVID or in the middle of COVID, there's a lot more pressure on governments to get the work out quicker. And you're seeing, and particularly with the timing here around elections, you're seeing a lot of announcements and a lot of pressure on departments to get their projects through quicker without the level of analysis that there once was a few years ago. I think that will settle down, but it is definitely part of the market that we're seeing at the moment here in Australia.
Yes, it's certainly part of the turbulence right now. The overused and much abused term of shovel ready must have had record airplay sort of mid-2020. But I would say that the years of prior work by IA, but also by IPA, by Adrian and his team on formulating pipelines and keeping them updated have by my observation, largely reduced the call that you would typically hear from industry. We don't know what the pipeline is. Give us a better indication. You know, I think a lot of that angst has dissipated, so that in any call for shovel-ready projects, or whatever you might like to call them, there's already a baseline from which project opportunities can be drawn, they can be brought forward, but there's something to work with already. So I think that's been a major benefit of the last 5, 6, 7 years of work by IA and by IPA.
But
Yeah,
also sorry, I was just going to add to that, the shift in discussion, again led by IA, is to think about contracting for services, so infrastructure as a service, infrastructure as a model. And I think the more that we do that, the more pressure will be on governments when to filter these projects, not by is it shovel ready or can I get it out the door quickly, but what impact does it have on the community, and you have to explain the project in that context. What is the value to the community, rather than is it ready to employ jobs immediately, and is it shovel ready? So we need to sort of shift that debate.
I really agree with that, Paul. I think shovel worthy is a much better conversation than shovel ready. There's a massive list of projects, and for us during COVID, as you know, the infrastructure body in Queensland, we sat on all of those task forces talking about it's a mix of small run and large run, and it's actually about social value. And how do we create that more locally led decision making is incredibly important. So I'd really reiterate your comments there, Paul.
I would reiterate that as well. I think I like the idea of infra worthy. I think that's a great thing to advance, particularly as we look at the changing procurement model around some of those ESG requirements that some of our co-panelists were talking about, and thinking about how we evolve the model to include those social purposes, including mentorship and development of skilled trades, which we all know certainly in Canada is a challenge for us right now, as some of the mega projects come out around transit or mega hospitals, or the expansion of the electrical grid or broadband. Those social policies and objectives through that procurement program are going to be more important, and the method for getting infrastructure out to the market will have to consider them.
Yeah, Jenny, I think that's a really good, sorry.
No, I was just going to say that's a really great point too, yeah.
Bringing this idea that social infrastructure is in a bucket and transport infrastructure is in a bucket, and then there's energy infrastructure. It's actually how you coordinate across those sectors and how infrastructure links industries, people. It's that enabling and transforming piece. If you look at it holistically as an ecosystem, that's where you get the cumulative impacts. That's where you can bring in the private sector. When we still deliver those things in a silo, and we deliver a hospital without looking at the PT network, without thinking about it as a precinct. One of the other pieces of work we're doing with the state infrastructure strategy, you know, it's obviously led by the state, but we're heavily involved, is really looking at industry precincts. So how do we look at even embedding sort of circular economy principles and saying, well, these are the sorts of industries that can help each other, use each other's waste, bring down the cost. What does that mean for the infrastructure corridor? Is it import and export? Where does it need to connect to? Should we be incentivizing that industry to move north because that's where the water is? So really trying to make those coordinated decisions, which I really see as the role of government to be able to make those, give confidence to the market around how they're going to support that coordination.
Yeah, and that's a really key piece. I mean, that is where we see quite a big sort of disconnect and disjointed effort among levels of government. And, you know, it's likely similar in other jurisdictions where, you know, we are not necessarily making coordinated decisions around our networks and the infrastructure and how our communities are interacting with the networks and the infrastructure, and you know how our populations are evolving over time, how their needs are evolving, how you know our economies are evolving. So these are all things that, you know, as we kind of take maybe a more centralized approach to our assessment and some of the policy questions, that's where we can have potentially quite a big impact, is to help sort of feed the data into that better coordination across levels of government. The other thing I would just add on this particular question is, for me, one of the biggest challenges is not what delivery model do we deliver the assets under. I mean, we should choose delivery models that are adequate to achieve the outcomes and the results that we're looking for. But, the biggest challenge for us here in Canada is that there is, we've been in stimulus for over a decade now. And there is so much demand on, I think that quite a small industry here still, that, one of the things you can use the delivery models for is to create additional capacity in the market. And, the faster, in some ways, the faster we can prioritize projects that should be prioritized, the more streamlined a way we can actually deliver those projects, the more quickly we can deliver those projects, the much more we reduce our exposure to things like inflation risk. We reduce the exposure, I think, of the market participants around delivery models that are inadequate, and risk transfer models that are not that are just not yielding for us. So I think it is important for us to be thinking about all those things kind of in an ecosystem, right? We need all of them.
Yeah, Olivia, I'd really love to jump in on this point, because you've touched on one of those three focus areas for IA, and indeed Priscilla has as well. So that interaction of assets and communities sits within our place frame. And I would say it is, right at the top of our thinking. However, it is essential to also maintain a view on optimizing networks and the operation of the network and the role a single asset plays in it, as well as thinking about the interaction of the asset with the community. I mean, a gas pipeline is a great example. There's not a high level of interaction with the pipeline and the community it runs through. It needs to be considered, but it's not the principal consideration. Then secondly, on industry, we in Australia are likely to see over the next 2 years 100% increase in mega projects, principally concentrated in the transport sector. More than 70% of those projects, over $1 billion, will be in the transport sector. We know we don't have the skills, the labour force, access to some of the materials that we're going to require in order to deliver those expectations. And we've been asked by our National Cabinet to look into those issues. And again, in August, we're going to have more to say on that front. But the solution to those sort of challenges, in part, is about thinking much more in an ecosystem style way. And I'd point to the Project 13 principles out of the UK as starting this conversation. We need to think absolutely about collaborative contracting models. We need to think about development of supply chains, particularly the role of sovereign supply chains in this current climate. We need to think about the role of digitalization in enabling organizations to work across projects seamlessly. We need to think about intellectual property and how the client can hold it and redeploy it on future projects. And we really importantly need to think about engaging the entire supply chain and the breadth of industry in order to deliver projects, which could mean smaller project packaging. It will mean a different view of risk and risk allocation, and really a maturing of the market overall. And we have historically looked to Canada and your experience to inform our own thinking here as we look to the UK and elsewhere. And I'm really pleased and proud that we've been able to partner with the Global Infrastructure Hub to bring together IA bodies across the world already this year, something we're going to do again shortly, in order to promote that environment of sharing. And efforts like this one, this group, and domestically, Adrian and Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, to allow that sharing are really critical. So I just want to emphasize that need to push to the next frontier of sector productivity together. We'll learn from each other, and we probably want to create an environment where we don't all have to make the same mistake. One person can do it, and then we can learn from another.
Can I just come in? I don't want to be the I'm going to do a word of caution on some of this stuff, but I don't want to be seen as the sort of person that depresses everyone. There was the discussion around the correct procurement model and the degree of stimulus money that's going in at the moment, and some of the things that Pete's just said. We're in serious danger of building a bunch of stuff that we don't have the capacity to maintain, and that we're not including whole of life maintenance within the way we procure because of the rush to build things. And that has a couple of impacts. We're probably not optimizing those things of capital spend versus the operational spend of them, because the intent is to get stuff built. And we're also not building in the funding capacity to maintain and operate those things into the future. So Paul made the point earlier that the sort of ebb and flow has gone towards quick to market rather than doing the analysis. I'd argue that to our potential long-term detriment at the moment, we're not factoring in the maintenance and operational funding. So in your advice as you go through the needs assessment, I would encourage as much focus on that piece as the capital piece.
Yeah, that has been a chronic issue here in Canada. I mean, those come out of separate pools. The funding sources are totally different for them. We have a chronic underfunding of operations and maintenance, recapitalization of our assets. That is a challenge here.
It's been lost in the PPP debate here. There has been an obsessive focus on the risk allocation at the front end and the sustainability of the contracting sector, which is a perfectly legitimate concern to have. But what's been lost is all of those other benefits you get from having an optimized approach to the deployment of money over the whole of life. And my hope is that we can arrive at new models that can deploy that best of long-term investor perspective in the way we structure our projects and deals.
Yeah, I would certainly echo that as well, Adrian. I think we are seeing a movement towards dropping the M off the DBF or the O&M off DBF O&M. And I would agree with you that sort of short-term thinking, I think it doesn't reflect the objectives that are set out in the infrastructure assessment paper, and certainly prohibits us from achieving some of the objectives, including around sustainability again, where we will fail to consider operational carbon, for example, and the long-term impacts of the infrastructure as well. So there are a number of reasons, including shortchanging ourselves in building the product, as you said, and then failing to maintain it and ending up back in the infrastructure deficit once again.
It's got a really big issue around integration as well. When you don't take that whole of life into account, when you're building a new rail or you're bringing in a slightly different set, how they integrate from a transport perspective. I think that whole it's a new world, new models is really keen, Adrian. We agree with that. We've actually just started a little research piece, partnered with a couple of agencies in Queensland government to really test in what classes and under what circumstances may we be able to create some new models that look a little bit different, that are acceptable to the Queensland community. So it's early stages yet, but there's a real appetite to look at how we do this a bit differently. And that whole of life, I think, is one of the most critical opportunities. So I think people are starting to recognise that it comes back to bite us if we don't do it well at the front end.
And I'd also say with the current community sentiment about climate change and climate catastrophe, that's going to be a kind of very much a non-negotiable. So at this point, we've got 20 minutes sort of left in the session. I'd like to sort of call on some of our Canadian government colleagues who are here with us, Andrew, Tasha, Robert, Gerard. If you had any questions, I think now would be a great moment to start to bring them forward.
Maybe I can start. It's been a fascinating and very interesting conversation. Learned a lot from the experience of the Australian panelists here. So thank you for that, first of all. I have a question that kind of relates to the distinction between the assessment and maybe, from what I understood from the approach taken in Australia, the sort of the reform and the implementation. Because it struck me that sort of in the assessment and the plan phase of the work that was being undertaken, it's all about figuring out the what you need to build, where you need to build it, that sort of thing, the prioritization amongst the various types of infrastructure that society is looking for. And then you sort of put off to implementation phases or latter phases the idea of what are the strategies or the policies you need to undertake to get you into a position to build that, and then an actual implementation plan to do it. And I didn't get the impression as much that the aspect of financing and funding the infrastructure, I mean, apart from the notion of that was mentioned about, having an envelope would be really helpful. But the sort of the strategies around financing and funding infrastructure, that, for example, in my role in Canada Infrastructure Bank is about bringing in more capital and private capital, didn't factor in as much to the assessment. But maybe I'm getting that wrong, because I kind of think you almost need to look at the two together to be able to come up with the right bucket and sort of not miss the target, if you will. So maybe just a comment on that would be interesting.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's actually been an evolving part of the structure of the federal government and the delineation of roles. And it's an area that continues to emerge currently. So within the federal level of government, our Australian government, we have ourselves as undertaking strategic planning and then also assurance of investment, sitting within the infrastructure portfolio, alongside policy setting around obviously infrastructure, transport, communication, the arts, and some other sectors. Energy, some other sectors, not telco, it was historically, sat off separately. So we're an interesting agency in that we look across government, but only at that strategic planning phase. Separately, business case development and the planning process around projects will live in those home agencies, wherever they happen to be across government, some of them closer to us, some further away. And in fact, there's a new office being developed within our own portfolio called the Special Projects Investment Delivery Office, SPIDO, a bit of a mouthful, who are currently undertaking some work around, for instance, intermodal terminals and developing business cases there. So they'll develop a business case. It generally works to an area that we've identified as a priority. And once the business case is developed, we'll undertake a review of it. Once the business case is, if you like, accepted on a quality framework by us, and indeed slightly beforehand, they'll work with another agency, the Infrastructure and Project Finance Agency, who sits within the Treasury, in order to develop a funding model for that project. And our role isn't to assess the funding model. We don't have a role there. We do occasionally reflect on whether or not it's a model that it's proven or there's capability around within the level of government that's implementing. And we might, for instance, we certainly have in the past identified that a model is right for the capability of the government, or for instance, there's an opportunity for third-party revenue like tolling. And then it will be ultimately procured both between the agency and Infrastructure Project Financing Agency working together. That is a bit of an evolution, and some change is expected to continue, but the majority of infrastructure is procured by state and territory governments separate to us, so we don't have a direct hand in that. We do have a policy view across these areas, though, which we talk to, from time to time.
I think this goes to the importance of the policy advice that Pete produced. If you look across the recommendations in the 2016 Australian Infrastructure Plan, a good proportion of them were essentially about how you move towards a more sustainable funding platform for infrastructure. And boiled down to its simplest, you have two ways to fund infrastructure: user pays or taxpayer pays. Everything else is a subset of those things. And once you have the funding stream in place, either from a toll or a tax, then you can deal with the financing afterwards. And as we know, there's no shortage of capital to meet that financing need across Australia or Canada. But the funding part is dealt with largely through the reforms that Pete and his team so eloquently articulate in their work.
Yeah, that makes sense. The policy lens on the funding models and opportunities being kind of aligned to the overall assessment and then the plan. Yeah, thanks.
I might just say, I feel very passionately about this, that you shouldn't have an infrastructure body that just produces lists without doing the policy piece, because the only way you can have the credibility on producing the list is if you're also producing the policy platform that shows how you can pay for that list.
The only body like IA in Australia, so we recently, briefly had an iBody in every jurisdiction. The only one that no longer exists didn't have a policy function.
Adrian, as a follow-up to that question, because we've got Alberta Infrastructure on the line, you know, you mentioned user pay and you know, using local taxes and levies and that sort of thing. Those sort of items are politically charged in Canada. Curious to know how you were able to gain support for those tools.
It's totally benign here. There's no politics at all around user charging. It's yeah, it's exactly the same here. I think to give you a pithy view on it, I think like every reform has its time, and the most important thing is that you're there with the work done and the ducks lined up at the moment when it's possible to strike and make a reform happen. It's rarely going to be perfect, and it'll have rough edges on it, but most reforms incremental. So start small and work through. We've recently had a bit of success around road user charging, where we've identified an opportunity with the onset of new technologies around electric vehicles, so you can implement a road user charge alongside incentives for electric vehicles, so that you can both encourage electrification but also have a sustainable funding platform. And that's just been legislated in Victoria starting from 1 July, a distance-based charge on electric vehicles, which is one of the only ones in the world in a democracy. And it's been done because it was of 30 years of work by all sorts of organisations arguing the case for road user charging, and then a bit of opportunism about getting it through with an emerging technology. So it's not easy, but as long as you've got the bodies like IA and ourselves and others there that keep pushing the barrow, I think you can hit the opportunities when they arise.
Great, thanks.
We're actually underestimating community expectations for change. I think there's a real appetite to have this conversation with communities now when we're missing a trick. I think they can see there's much more visibility of the lack of sustainability. Cities are all starting to get back to work, sort of, well, in Australia, back to normal, but traffic is chaos going in and out of the CBD here in Brisbane, even though it's only 30% of a workforce in and out of the city at any time because no one's taking public transport. So there's a real opportunity here to talk to communities about what do we want, what does the infrastructure look like, and how do we fund it? And the funding mechanisms don't work for a future world. I just don't think we've worked out how to have the conversation. I don't think it's about that the community's not ready. I don't think industry and government are mature enough to work out how to have the conversation sensibly. And that's a leadership conversation. It's a behaviours conversation. We tend to focus as an industry on process and procurement and risk and all those things that we're great at. What we're not spending our time on is how do we become really genuine leaders that can actually inspire the community to get on board with the agenda. That's a really big gap for us.
Can I just, oh, sorry, Paul, go ahead.
I was just going to add that I think there's a legacy of where assets have been, I guess, tolled, but the service delivery hasn't improved. And I think if we're going to win that argument with the public, we need to be focused on, well, if you're paying for use of infrastructure, what is the benefit? And I think people will pay for benefit, but it's when there's no benefit, I think that's when we're struggling to win that debate.
That's exactly what I was going to say, Paul. Couldn't agree more. For 20 years in different roles, I've been polling the community over their support for tolls versus taxes versus other payment mechanisms. And in every poll I've ever done, people have preferred user pays. It has always been the only area where there's over 50% support in the community. Of course, everyone would rather their neighbour pays than them, but that is kind of a complexity in the model. But it's where they don't understand what they're paying for, and where there's been an inappropriate or unreasonable expectation that what they're paying is linked to service, that people are disappointed. But we're now in a different environment where people aren't prepared to accept bad service if they're paying. So the infrastructure sector, just like the rest of the economy, needs to understand that consumers have expectations around services and to enter into agreement with the community around what that looks like. And the contractual models we use for buying infrastructure need to be sufficiently responsive in order to respond to that. And a great example here, one that I have familiarity with, is toll roads, where the roads are fundamentally congested, but the toll road operators had no ability to pursue improvements in their assets. It was only after they were able to amend their contracts to allow investment in the asset that some of that animosity dissipated.
Well, look, that fundamentally comes back to what is the outcome. Infrastructure as a service. They're not paying for a tunnel, they're paying to get to the other side of the city quicker. And if it doesn't deliver that, then it's failed. And communities aren't silly. It is all about service and what's the final outcome. And that comes back to how you procure it, how you set up your contracting, and to Adrian's point, whole of life, because it can't just be about, what you've constructed.
Great, thanks for that. I'm just looking at time, there's about 1 minute left, and I just want to ask anyone from the Canadian government side if there's any additional questions.
I'd love to jump in, perhaps not so much with a question, but just kind of an observation and reflection. This has been a fantastic session. I just want to thank everyone from Australia. It seems like as we go through the meeting, you guys are gaining steam and we're losing it, but maybe that's just because of the time of day. I think I really kind of appreciated some of the conversation around how to kind of situate politics and infrastructure. That's obviously very central to what we're trying to do with the National Infrastructure Assessment. Fully agree with comments made by Adrian and Peter on the role of politics in really kind of making the investment decisions. And really what we're trying to do in Canada right now is to put a bit of a middle piece between some of the data and evidence that we have, some of the knowledge that we have, but then kind of add that independent advice. And so kind of in that, some of the conversations around, Peter, you mentioned, you got to have methodology and data. You can have, everyone has an opinion, but if you have that methodology that kind of puts your data to work in a way that people can kind of verify, they can have informed disagreements over that, but everybody knows how it was derived. Really great point on the maintaining versus new building, and the attraction to the shiny object of the new and great piece of infrastructure. I think that's going to be really one for us to kind of grapple with in terms of how do we make sure that we are recapitalizing, dealing with depreciation, some of these things that are going to be hard to get people excited about, but that we kind of factor in. And I think people talked a little bit about, kind of what does it take to set priorities? And it's hard to set priorities if there's no constraint. And, the UK had their fiscal remit, in a federation, it might be trickier to kind of do something like that. I think that that's going to be a challenge for us in terms of how do we figure out how to endow our independent body with some kind of a constraint that drives trade-offs and drives prioritization. So I think that's going to be an area that we're really going to need to look at. But those are just a couple really high-level observations. I know we're at time, and over here in Canada, we're all getting tired. So perhaps I'll leave it at that, and again extend my thanks to the organizers and to everybody on the panel.
Thanks, Gerard. I think the last word's going to go to Olivia to wrap us up. But my thanks from Catherine and I for being such a great set of panelists.
Yes, thank you to Catherine and Rowan for chairing this meeting today. Thank you to all the panelists. We got through a whole lot in 90 minutes, I think, which was fantastic. I think we had some great takeaways. One of the big ones for me, which was great to hear, was that we need to challenge ourselves to inspire people and to demonstrate that leadership in terms of bringing people along to the delivery solutions that are going to benefit them. So, you know, how do we think about doing that? I think that's a great message for all of us as we think ahead to what's coming down the pipe. Thank you all for taking the time out. I wish you all a wonderful either evening or day, depending on where you are. And we'll look forward to seeing some of you again soon in the next few days. Wonderful to have you all. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.